Alright guys, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to cover how to draw Batman. So we're going to jump right on into it. First off, I'm using something new. I'm using actually the Blackwing pencil. I just learned about these pencils. They just came back into production, so I picked me up some and I'm going to try that out today and see how it works. So starting off, I always like to use the Loomis method. Pretty much, most people do that. That's how I really learned to get my proportions a lot more accurate. And just kind of building off from there. Even if you're doing something like a comic book character, it's still important to learn correct proportions and things of that nature. So make sure if you're still studying and learning to draw yourself, that you're learning those important fundamentals. So keeping in mind, drawing a character like Batman, very thick and heavy bodied and very menacing and kind of dark looking. So you want to make sure that what I go for are thicker, bolder lines and sort of heavier. I don't like to do too much fine detailing with him, just because I'm more concerned with big, large planes and areas of shadow and things like that. And you want to make sure you're not using very thin, wispy lines. You want to be a little bit bulkier and heavier, a little bit more geometric with his sort of proportion style. One kind of cool thing about really comics in general, this is the great thing about the medium. There's so much room for input. So you can take Batman and say his costume, and you can do so many different variations of style with this character. I think it's one of the reasons he's so fun to draw. You can go for a very like skin tight sort of look, where basically there's no real separation between his underlying form and the suit, and a heavy stylized version of the costume. I'm thinking of like the early 90s style of comic artists, the Todd McFarlane's, Jim Lee's, and those guys. Or you can go a little bit more on the other end. One of my favorite artists is Jason Fabok. He very much influenced by another fantastic artist, David Finch. And Fabok specifically, he has a lot more of a realistic take. It's definitely a hyper-realistic take, in that it's a blend of sort of more traditional comic book stuff mixed with like really fine detailing and super proportioned, even if just a little bit exaggerated anatomy. So I think I love artists like that, where you can kind of have a happy medium where you're blending both. I like the hyper stylized stuff still. I do. Say like Mike Mignola, one of my favorite artists. But I also really have appreciation for fine detailing and correct proportions, the just kind of technicality of all that. So if I can find a happy blend between the two, then I'm good to go. All right, so most people, I see a strong divide on the ears. I like to go for a medium length ear. Maybe I'm just kind of sitting on the fence there, but some people can pull off the super long ears. I don't like them too much, because I always think, well, how are you going to fight with the giant ears, if they're like 5 feet tall? It can kind of look cool for, one-off illustrations, but if you were like telling an actual Batman story, that would get in the way. That would bother me too much. And then on the flip side of that, the problem with super tiny ears to me is, well, he just starts to look like Catman now, and we don't need that. So I like to meet in the middle. This is sort of the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight style of ear, I guess you could say. So one thing I always, and this is super important for any of you young artists out there, is I always allow my stuff to look, honestly, kind of like crap to my eye. Like, I usually don't like my initial sketches on most things. I'm just trying to make sure things are looking correct more than anything. But I think you have to, and it takes time to build this trust with yourself, but over time you'll learn that if you're studying and you're learning more and more, that the further you go, everyone says trust the process, but it's really true. The further you go with it, if you keep doing the correct things, then it's going to turn out looking all right in the end. You're at least going to be happy with the work you put in. So I'm going to go in and use a kneaded eraser here. I love kneaded erasers. It's my favorite eraser. They leave no mess. There's no shards. They pick up really well. You might have to go over with a regular eraser on some super dark lines if you made a big enough mistake, but overall, I carry this thing with me everywhere. I love kneaded erasers, and they last a really long time too. So I got my basic structure put in. Built. I really like to build off the eyebrows, especially with Batman. A heavy brow to kind of set the eyes inside of. That's great. Kind of put where the nose needs to be, the basic form of the mouth. But this is still a very flat, barely two-dimensional picture here. So we're going to start going in and adding some values. So always make sure you pick your light source. I'm going to do mine. I'm going to probably say from the top, sort of right of his head, kind of looking down. So that's going to inform where you put your shadows, where you put your values. So make sure, again, for you more, if you're a beginner artist out there and you're getting a little bit tripped up on, okay, well, where do I put all these shadows? And I made the mistake, like most people do when they first start drawing, of, well, these shadows look cool because I'm seeing it in the comic books, so I'm just going to pick that shadow and put it on my character. But you don't want to do that. Any artist you see published should understand, at least for the most part, how values work and lighting works to pull off a convincing character. Because even though this isn't reality, it still needs to some degree obey the rules of reality, and if you want to pull off that illusion. So I'm going to start laying in. I like to really pick the divide between light and dark. So I'm finding the harshest edges I can, where it's going to be very dark, and starting to transition more to a very light area. And I don't do too much hatching. I'm doing a little bit just because I know I want to keep certain lines there, but I really like to do the big heavy shadows first before I worry about the finer hatching details. So we're going to divide that shape of the head. Keep in mind, shape of the head, it's a sphere, So if you practice shading that sphere like we all did in art class, that's going to come in handy. That's why we learned that stuff. Again, going to emphasize the heaviness of that brow. And I have thoughts on the Blackwing pencil for any of you who are enthusiasts of it. If we like this video, we want to see more, I considered doing maybe a review of the pencil. I do have thoughts. I was really hyped to learn about it because I heard it was really popular amongst illustrators and writers and musicians even, because they would use it to write their sheet music. So I was eager to pick these up, and I would definitely like to try more variations because there's a handful of different lead types, but for now I would say mostly pleased with it. So when you're going in and you're adding values, I know for the most part now what I'm going to use. I think you need to be very careful starting out on not getting carried away in just one spot. So for instance, I wouldn't start up at the ears and render them completely. I wouldn't shade them in completely. I would get the basics of what I'm going to put down there, and then I would move on, and I'm just kind of inputting the first step or so of the shading process everywhere on him instead of fully rendering one area at a time. That would take longer to my eye, and it's just, I tend to bounce around anyway. And then we're going to go through and we'll be inking this at the end, so you get to see a little bit of that process as well. Another great reason to divide your darks from lights like this is when you can define what areas are furthest away from light. So I'm going to say like the side of his head right there, and even the underside of his nose, and the underside of the eyebrows. You're making it easier on yourself. So you're getting to see these big chunks of black that are heavily covered in shadow. And that just helps separate the different planes of the face. It helps define your forms a lot better. And it just helps it just makes it a lot easier for your own eye to kind of see, okay, well, I got that step down. If this is the heavier form, the heavier mass on his face, Then over here it's going to be a little bit lighter, so I can start to use some more, finer shading. Some, if you're doing a fine art portrait, some blending, or in this case hatching, since we're doing comics. But just really going in and just finding those areas that are completely covered in shadow will really help you to see what you're looking at better, and also help make your work pop, because this is Batman, so we want him to stand out. We want him to be bold. You don't want him muted and subtle. So if you notice, I put down some X's for those who aren't familiar with what those are. That's just most comic artists use that. So when you're in the penciling stage like we are, you can place an X down, and that's just to symbolize that you're going to go back through and fill that entire area with black. So pretty much I've got most of what I need laid out. It doesn't look like much yet, but I've got most of what I need already for the inking process. I do let myself skip a little bit of the penciling stage. I don't fully render it in the pencil stage first, just because, I also have been inking for a while, and so I kind of know where I want to go with things and trust myself to kind of add what I need to off the cuff in the inking stage. And so I just kind of have that trust. If you're, less familiar with inking, by all means, go through, fully render it in pencil first if that makes you feel more comfortable. And a funny note, I tend to feel like I really like my stuff a lot better. I don't think my stuff looks a great deal like really that good, honestly, until it's inked. It's not breathtaking, I don't think, by any means, but I think it does look a lot better once it's finally inked. I don't know what it is. It just, maybe it's the high contrast of it all, but to me, to my eye, I just tend to like it more once it's inked. Very rarely do I leave things in just pencil. Another great thing to point out here, I'm going over and I'm just touching up a few things. It's kind of random spots it might look like, but I'm touching up areas that I know I want to add more line weight. And line weight is really could do a whole video in and of itself on line weight, but essentially, you don't want all your, you don't want all your lines the same thickness. You know, certain forms are bigger than others, and we all know that. So you need to convey that with your lines. So, and that will, it's affected by the size of things, but it's also affected by, what part of the form is closer to your light source and things like that. So, for instance, the tip of his nose on his cowl is going to have a thinner line than, say, his jaw or the back of his head or something like that, or even maybe one of the ears. You're not going to want to use the same thickness of line because, well, those are, one form is heavier and further away from the light source than the other. So you want to convey that in your lines. Again, that could be a whole video on itself. I'm just going to go through, fill in a little bit of the area, just kind of scribble around. And like I said, for the most part, we're pretty much about ready to go. Just like to tweak and tidy up a couple things before we start the inking process. We're about good. One thing I really like to emphasize on him is the lower part of, what would you call this? So the lower corners of the mouth, I don't know what those muscles would be called. It's where if you drew a line from the corner of your nose down in front of your cheekbones, sort of where your jaw begins to tie into the lower part of your mouth, there's sort of like a ball-like form. And I noticed heavier, thicker, more like muscly people tend to have more defined areas of that, particularly if their face is very lean. So I do like to really emphasize that on him. I think it's just so cool. All right, so we're gonna jump into the inking process here. So I really just I don't have any magical tools. I like to use just what looks best to me and is also easiest to use. So I do use microns because you can get some nice variation in nib sizes. So I use a combination of I use a brush micron for convenience. I use a couple different sized nibs, some for thicker, bolder lines to start off. I'm using the 0.8 right here. I like to go in first, and I use the brush, but I actually tend to like using the pen first as an initial outline, just because I can guarantee more accurately that I'm gonna get the line that I need out of it. I'm still not perfect using a brush, and honestly, I rush. And so sometimes when I use a brush, I end up having to go back with some whiteout and kind of correct certain things. And so I've learned, I'm also picky, so just the control of the pen works better for me. Some people are way more confident and can just, you had Kim Jong-gi, he would draw, I think, pretty much everything with just a brush pen. So it just really depends on what you're more comfortable with. And I like to be careful. You take your time. If you'll see, I'm not moving as fast in this stage as I was with the pencil stage. Inking is an art form in and of itself. It's a different medium. It requires some different skills. You need to have the hand control there. You need to have the focus and the precision. Every line matters with inking. Not to say that you won't make a mistake. Of course you will, but whereas the pencil stage, you can be and honestly want to be a bit more loose. You want to capture that energy in your lines. With the inking stage, to my mind, the way I like to approach it is like, okay, you are finishing the form, like you're rendering it fully, and this is, it's being set in stone, so to speak. So you want it to be really well thought out, really well crafted, and you want your hand under control, and you want to be precise. So paying attention to, let's say, the size of different lines. I'm still using the 0.8 right here, my thickest nib. I'm going in and outlining everything with that, and I'm just paying attention to detail on which lines should be thicker. And if I notice that there's some finer detailing, like say in the forehead, I can see a handful of lines that are going to need to be a little bit finer, then I'll switch it off to a smaller nib to capture that fineness of the line, because all that stuff matters. When it comes to filling in the large areas of black, which we'll get to in a moment, if it's a sketch, then really, I tend to like to just use a Sharpie, honestly, if it's not something that I'm gonna try and sell, or if it's just it's a one-off kind of fun thing. I just I'm practicing or something like that. I just tend to use the Sharpie. But for anything that I want to last, like something I would consider a complete illustration, I actually do like to whip out a real brush and a bottle of ink. I just find you could trust it more. It's more pigmenty. It lasts a lot longer. And over time, Sharpies, they do fade, and if you like the piece of art you've got, you want it to last longer and keep it, well, I really highly recommend you kind of stay away from Sharpies if that's the case. If you're just messing around, you want to practice, you're just practicing different techniques with inking, that's, it's up to you, it's totally fine. But I've just found that if it's anything I consider more professional, then I want to trust that, it's going to last for as long as possible. And also it can move you maybe just a little bit quicker than even a Sharpie. You don't have to run through it as quick either. So I can give an inking video demonstration at some point, but I do like to, for lines that are closer to the shadow at the bottom of the line, I do like to make a little bit thicker. I'll have to do a close-up video one of these days, but just kind of making the base of your hatching line a little bit thicker, and it thins out in a sort of flicking motion. That really creates a cool effect. It helps pull off the illusion that the light is receding, and kind of gives a little bit more depth to your form. So much to learn. There's so much you could point out. You could spend entire videos on all these things. And we're going to go through now and speed it up a little bit. Cut through a little bit of the tedious process. So if you notice some of those lines that are a little bit thicker at the bottom, kind of just delineates curvature, helps kind of give that dimension to things. And it starts to come to life. Now, one thing I don't really use in this video, but it is super useful for just creating that higher contrast, more poppy effect, is you can get yourself a white gel pen or some sort of whiteout, and drawing the white on top of the black ink for added contrasty effect is super cool. A lot of times I do use it on his eyes. I don't use it in this one. I just didn't feel the need to. But depending on the lighting you've got going on, if you're trying to create something that really stands out, just going ahead and filling in an entire area in black, then going back over it with the white, it just helps create a better effect to my mind than it does just leaving the area blank. So I'm going to go in and finally get everything filled in. You'll see with the brush here, just kind of covering the areas as quickly as possible. And one reason I do like to use a traditional brush and ink setup is a lot of times you can get a bit of a very naturalistic look to things. So if you'll notice the feathering on the side of his shoulder right there, there's unintentional things that I've noticed tend to come about that I look at a lot of times and I'm like, I think I'm going to keep that. So I guess, happy little accents that you just kind of stumble upon sometimes that you may not have intended for. And I always enjoy those, and you can't get those kinds of unintentional effects if you're using, I was going to say digital, but sometimes even with the pen, unless those 1 in a million mistakes where it just happens to look correct, you're just not going to get the same thing out of that. It's just different with the brush. So it's just really cool if you like a little bit more of that kind of looser, naturalistic kind of feel to, say, your inks, then I highly recommend using a brush and just playing around with that. One of the best artists I know who gets such cool, unique, expressive lines and gradations out of his ink work is Sean Gordon Murphy, one of my favorite artists ever. His ink work is just amazing. Really hard to kind of teach that stuff too. I feel like you have to experiment quite a bit with your own work and seeing what works for you and what you like, what your tastes naturally are. So we're about rounding home. Getting close, just going to go through and touch up some areas. So if you notice, it's still very high contrast. So that means the areas of light and black are very close. And excuse me there. Sorry, what I was saying was the areas of the light and dark are very high contrast and very clearly separated. So you want to get some of those midtones, those middle values, those areas that aren't black and aren't pure white. That's when you want to start to add those, because that gives dimension to your form. It helps define things a lot better. It makes it feel a little bit more naturalistic, gives a little bit more of like that curvature feeling. So you want to, especially when you're inking, if you have a form that say you're inking just on a sphere, when you're adding those lines, you want those lines to wrap around the sphere in the direction that sphere's curvature is moving. So, and that same approach you take with anything that you're inking. In this case, Batman. So where his shoulder maybe kind of dips down into like sort of a divot between the meat of his shoulder and his collarbone, you want those lines to dip down as well. If you have the top of his forehead meeting the side of his head, you want those lines to curve into that direction. So just being very intentional about like not just where you put the lines, but how you lay the lines down and how they wrap around each other will very much give a lot more of like a believable look and feel to your ink work. And from here on, this is really just the tidying up stage, just being really picky and looking for things that I could improve a little bit. So we mentioned line weight, so I'm about to go back over and look for forms that are kind of sticking out to me a little bit too much. They feel a little bit too light and unbalanced. So areas that I think just kind of need to be bulked up a little bit, get a little bit more of a heavier feel to them. And I think we're going to finally break out the brush pen here. One reason I like using the compact sort of preloaded brush pens is just really their easiness. You can be a lot more precise with them. You get to vary your line weight really quickly. And it's just great for just touching up little details, even areas of shadow that are like not as big as say the entire side of his head here. If you're doing something and you have like a chunk of shadow that's not tiny, but it's not massive either, I just find just honestly just whipping out the brush pen and just filling it in really quickly, especially if it's not a perfectly defined area, you can kind of fit the tip of the brush wherever you need it. Just kind of you have the control with it that I just don't feel you can quite get out of a Sharpie. All the little nuances that you might need aren't there with a Sharpie, so it's just really handy for that. One reason I wanted to do this video, the kind of thought behind it was I always wished sometimes when looking at some of my favorite artists, when they would draw a character, you would see cuts a lot of the time, unless it was a sketch, like a quick sketch, but you wouldn't always see the full process of what they were drawing as much as you would like, at least for me. I always wanted to study and like, okay, how do these guys do this? And just having this type of video where you see the full process, I tried not to speed it up too much because I think the tediousness does matter I think paying attention to how someone puts their lines down, and granted, this is my own, version of it, but still, it matters. Just kind of taking your time with that and really soaking up the full process, and getting to see it from the initial sketch, step by step by step, is just super helpful. It always was to me. So I wanted to pass that along. But anyway, that is just about going to do it here. Nice little Batman sketch. And thank you guys for watching. If you liked this, I will definitely be making some more videos in the future, kind of just figuring out what I might want to do with this channel. But this was a lot of fun to make. If you like it, go ahead, let me know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.